Yellow and Red Makes by Digits 27, Chapter 2. The two talked long into the night until QB finally let him go. He rubbed the back of his head, smiling slightly, and looked around at the room he was in. He had been absently mindedly scratching QB behind the ears for the last portion of their conversation, an action she hadn't minded in the least if her low purring was anything to go on. When he removed said hand, she looked up at him with a sigh of disappointment, noticing the odd behavior. QB, it wasn't her name, but the accent Agent Fox let it slide because a human couldn't properly pronounce her Volpine name, even if they tried. Yes, Kit. Naruto was still annoyed by the semi-affectionate name, but also let it slide. It appeared that even here he could get tired. How do I leave? He blushed with embarrassment as he said it, not wanting to look like an idiot in front of her. QB only chuckled, a far less menacing sound coming from her smaller, less intimidating form. That is entirely up to you, Kit. This is your mind, after all. Naruto nodded without thinking until he heard the last part. What? QB only chuckled again, once again a strange thing coming from a fox. This is your mindscape, a visual representation of your mind's subconscious given form and solidity. Seeing the blank look on the boy's face, the old fox sighed, this time out of mild annoyance. I have to keep reminding myself you're only 7. 7.5? She gave him a sly grin. He couldn't help the laugh that came through her muzzle. The boy's innocence and naivety was too adorable. Right, Kit. Like I was saying, this is what your brain, she looked to make sure he was still with her, tells you your mind looks like. The boy still didn't seem to be getting what she was saying, and she sighed, something that had come far too common for her in the last hour or so. Okay, Kit, I want you to imagine a chair right over there. She pointed at a corner of the high ceiling room, and Naruto turned to look at it. After giving her a questioning glance, he did as he was asked, picturing a chair right where she pointed. When he opened his eyes, that's exactly what he saw, just like he had pictured in his mind a large, comfortable looking chair sprouting in the corner of the room. He jumped in joy and ran over to it, jumping on and playfully swinging himself around. He span until he became dizzy and half fell slash half climbed out of the large chair. He smiled at the fox with red cheeks and gleaming teeth. That's awesome. I've always wanted to sit in the Hokage's chair, but he always said that if I wanted to, I would have to work really hard and earn it. Suddenly, Naruto looked sadly and guilty, realizing he had sat in the chair without the old man's permission, and QB caught on to what he was feeling. I wouldn't worry about it, Kit. It wasn't really Sarutobi's chair, just a figment of your imagination. QB realized she had used long words again, so before Naruto could don his cute yet frustratingly confused expression, she hurried on. So like that chair, all you have to do is imagine yourself waking up, and you will do. She looked satisfied with her in-depth explanation and smirked, happy that she was actually able to dumb it down to his level, an intellectual challenge in its own right. A thought occurred to the ancient demon just as Naruto closed his eyes to imagine himself awake. Wait, Kit, one last thing. I have a request. Naruto opened his eyes and looked at her curiously, wondering what a millennia-old demon could possibly want with him. As you have noticed, this place, she looked around them, and Naruto knew she meant the sewer in general, is a bit dank for my taste. Could you possibly do something about it? Naruto thought on that a moment and tried to dredge up everything he knew about foxes, which was unsurprisingly limited, no thanks to people in Konoha's attitude towards the creatures. He guessed they were wild. He got that from QB's attitudes at least, mostly from her obvious displeasure at cages. The only wild places he knew about were forests, and the only forest he knew well enough to picture in his mind were the ones surrounding Konoha itself. Giving rise to its name, he thought really hard about everywhere he had been in the forest, from a few rivers he knew about to the natural hot springs. He included the sparse clearing that the older Shinobi used as training grounds whilst editing out the village itself. After all, he was sure that a giant fox had no use for buildings or ramen stands. When he was finally satisfied, he looked around in wonder at the QB herself, at the verdant forest that surrounded the pair. They were standing in the middle of Naruto's favorite clearing for training in, and he could even see the cut marks in the trees he used for shuriken training practice. He was amazed by how accurate the picture from his mind was and wondered how far it went. He was about to turn to the QB and ask what she thought about it, but when he did so, all he saw was her retreating form as she chased after a rabbit. Naruto chuckled for a moment at the outside of a demon acting like a common wild animal, but she seemed satisfied, maybe even happy, so Naruto once again attempted to wake himself. With some reluctance, he forced himself to imagine his apartment with all its little imperfections that added up into a one big imperfect hovel. He was careful not to apply this image to his new surroundings, lest he override QB's force, and suddenly he felt the opposite feeling than last time, rising instead of falling. Once again, there was that strange feeling of waking up without having actually gone to sleep, which messed with his senses for a moment. In a daze, he got up and looked around his apartment. He had collapsed on the floor, and the kunai knife was by his feet. He picked it up and slid it into a pocket, despite the fact that a few hours ago he was willing to kill himself with it. He would have thrown it out of the window, but they were expensive, especially with the prices the shopkeeper charged him specifically. Suddenly, thinking about the time, he looked outside and realized that it appeared no time at all he had passed since he'd fallen asleep or unconscious or whatever that was. Mindscape, Kit, Mindscape. Naruto jumped backwards from the window in alarm at hearing the voice ringing out in his mind. Still, the softer feminine voice inside of QB's menacing, powering voice. QB, you're in my mind. Naruto heard the great beast sigh, which proceeded to revert around his head. I would recommend that you don't shout out loud every time I commune with you. People will think you are crazy. Merely think what you wish to say and I can hear it. Naruto was a little startled by this particular revelation. So you can read my thoughts? Yes, Kit, I have done ever since I was sealed inside of you. Now we are done here. I have nearly caught that rabbit. Naruto waned to ask about the weird time difference between his mind and the real world, but he guessed it was self-explanatory and left the world and the old creature be. Nervous now about the fact that his every thought was being listened in on, he moved after about his apartment, gathering up the necessary supplies he would need for later. He tried to clear his mind of all thoughts, an exercise he had actually read about in his scrolls and had thought too silly to try. Now he wished he had paid more attention. He was unsuccessful, to say the least, as his mind kept darting from one thing to the next, mostly in excitement for what he was going to do. There were a few things he still needed but didn't have, so he would have to go out. Luckily, it was Sunday, so there was no school, and he happily jumped out the window onto the adjoining roof, where he flew across rooftops until he reached the food district. He kept at the mind clearing exercise unsuccessfully, while QB merely chuckled at him from inside his mind. Looking around the area, he looked for a place that would sell the items QB had told him to get. Easily portable, long-lasting, and easy to cook food, and before he could even suggest it, QB shot down the idea of instant ramen, mostly due to the fact that it was practically all he, and therefore she, had eaten in their 7 years. He collected what he could with what little money he had left and continued to walk around the area. He told himself it was because he was looking for more of the items on his internal list, but in reality he was just taking in the village for the very last time. He walked past the place he knew used to serve octopus balls, but had been closed up. There was a sign on the front of the shop that read, "Coming soon, Ichiraku's Ramen." He only glanced at it disinterestedly. There were a few ramen places in Konoha. There was nothing to say this one would have been special. He walked on through the food district, reaching the academy and simply staring at it. This place had been more of a home to him than his own apartment had in the last year. Here he could at least pretend to have friends and imagine that he could take part in their games of missing nin slash hunter nin. It was basically glorified hide and seek, but Naruto wouldn't have cared as long as he got to play. There were also the people in his class. He didn't know anybody specifically, but there was a girl, Sakura, who he had met, who he had a small crush on. He guessed he would have to forget about them all if he was to move on. Yes, Kit, it would be best if you cut all ties to your past here. It will make it easier for you to find a new and better life. Naruto started, still unused to the sudden appearance of QB's voice in his mind. Would you please stop scaring me like that? His only reply was a quiet chuckle before QB returned to what she was doing in his fox forest. He felt uncomfortable with the idea of merely forgetting about his friends and decided instead merely to not think about them anymore. He smiled and walked on. His friends may have been hard to forget, but that didn't mean it was the same for his teachers. His senseis never taught him anything, always making sure he got the rattiest textbooks and no proper tutelage at all. He would enjoy forgetting about all of them. He came to his final stop on his journey, the Hokage Tower, and quickly climbed up the side of it until he was on the roof. There was no point going in. While he would have liked to see the old man one last time, he knew that his receptionist wouldn't allow him to even touch the door if she could stop him. He sighed and thought it was for the best. Kyubi had told him to try and cut all ties, and that was what he was doing. The Hokage may hold a special place in Naruto's heart, but he couldn't let that cloud his decision to leave, which he knew it would if he saw him. Naruto wrestled with this for a while, along with his other few good memories of Konoha, before peacefully sitting back and looking at the Hokage monument until it became dark. He considered going out with a bang with some large elaborate prank to remind the villagers just who was leaving them. However, after some berating by Kyubi and some reconsideration, he decided against it. Something large and obvious wouldn't help him sneak out the village more easily, and he knew that it was just his old self acting out. The pranks had been a way to get people to notice him when they simply ignored the boy, and now that he was leaving, he didn't have to work for their approval or notice anymore. It was almost a relief, like some large weight had been lifted from his shoulders. With a new, smaller, but more genuine smile, he made his way, more slowly, but towards his apartment, where the rest of his needed gear was laid out on his bed, ready to be packed into his ruckus. It was dark when he set off. The sun had set hours ago, and it was long enough for the last remnants of the daylight to fade away. It hoped that there were thick clouds in the sky, not occasionally letting a sliver of silver moonlight trickle through the streets, not so stuck to the shadows, not risking taking the rooftops for fear of being caught by a patrolling Anbu or other shinobi. He knew he was at a severe disadvantage tonight. He couldn't use his chakra even if he could have effectively. Any burst of unknown chakra would have alerted any nearby Chunin or above with a modicum of training. That meant no henge. It honestly didn't make much of a difference to though, as Naruto was only in the first year of the academy. His skills with ninjutsu and genjutsu were mediocre at best. Before he made a break for the gates, Naruto had one last thing he needed to do, which Kyubi had warned against. For once, he ignored his new friend. This was just something he had to do. The old fox may have wanted him to cut all ties to his life here, but Naruto couldn't leave without one memento. It also satisfied his inner need to pull one last prank, even though it probably wouldn't be noticed for some time after he was gone. He would still feel the satisfaction from what he had done. He left the academy as quietly as he had entered, barely making a disturbance in the night as he put all his mastery of stealth into action. He had a satisfying grin plastered on his face, which he quickly quelled so his teeth wouldn't give away in the night. Naruto may have been one for the direct approach, but even he knew that when it wouldn't work. He gratefully listened to Kyubi's plan and silently moved around the village doing as she asked. It was far simpler than he would have imagined, as long as he didn't use any chakra and suppressed it like Kyubi told him to. He wasn't interrupted by any guards. After one nerve-wracking but useful circuit of the village walls, he was ready and found himself back where he had started, in front of the west gate, a few buildings away, so he could quietly observe the two tuning guards without them spotting him. He had hoped that the two of them might have dozed off and made his whole plan that much easier, but he was in no such luck. Both of them looked alert and attentive, ready to ward off threats and protect the gate they had been assigned to. Luckily, most of their attention was focused outwards, like in the training to also expect attacks from within, like the Anbu. Naruto's side, he had hoped to avoid this. He hadn't exactly been ecstatic when Kyubi had told him just what they would be doing to leave. Alright, Kyubi, I've done everything you asked so far. Now what? Inside of his mind, Kyubi grinned. She had watched him perform his task with skill unthought of for an academy student. Of course, she had been guiding him, but it still showed what a remarkable ninja he could possibly become. With her help, she would make sure that was someday soon. No need for her to make a weak container after all. At least that was what she told herself. Good job, Kit. Naruto beamed happily at the praise before she reminded him to keep his emotions in check and stick to the plan. Now make the hand sign I'm showing you in your head. Naruto's brow furrowed when she said this. But I can't do ninjutsu. Why am I making a hand sign? Kyubi sighed. She was starting to dislike having to explain everything she did to the young boy, no matter how necessary it was to his development. Don't worry about it. You just make the hand sign to focus the chakra, and I'll do the rest. Naruto wasn't sure about this, but he made the appropriate symbol with his hands. If you remembered correctly from his academy lessons, it was serpent. Really, his hands were just clasped together, but he hadn't questioned Kyubi yet. He suddenly felt a strange pulse run through his body. It hurt slightly, but only because it caused him discomfort, as if his body was trying to fight against the strange presence. Off to his right, he heard a cloud crackle fill the air as one of the many explosive tags he had placed on the village walls detonated. He hoped it would work properly. He had followed QB's instructions perfectly and only hoped he hadn't somehow messed up while writing them. It was putting his chakra into the paper that was the really hard part, though. He wondered how the people who nearly had to make them put up with it. At least from the sound of it, the plan was working so far. It wasn't a powerful bomb, probably not even enough to put a few cracks in the wall, but it was sufficient as a distraction. Sure enough, one of the Chunin guarding the gate moved off to the guard to investigate the sound, leaving his companion alone. It was exactly how QB thought they would act. Textbook strategy. Of course, the ancient demon had a few millennia on any human strategist, and even if she hadn't, it was fairly easy to outmaneuver this. Their fault was believing that there would only be one distraction. Naruto made the hand sign again and felt another pulse of the uncomfortable energy run through him. He had felt the effects of using chakra before, and it definitely wasn't like that, so he would have to ask QB later when they had a spare moment. It was a few late. It was a much later burst this time, and Naruto could hear its effects already all around the village. His strategically placed tags started detonating one by one, slowly drawing all the guards in the vicinity towards the disturbances. Thankfully, the guards remaining at this gate followed suit, moving away in the opposite direction to his companion and leaving the gate wide open. Naruto knew he only had one shot at this, and throwing caution to the wind, he ran full pelt at the abandoned gate, not stopping until he was a few hundred meters away, where he rested against a tree, grinning broadly. Even if the village somehow knew that he was leaving, there was no telling where he could have gone. The places of the tags all the way around the village saw to that. Happy that everything had gone off without a hitch, he walked away from the village, its walls receding away into the darkness of the night as he set out, determined to make his own life. For once, he felt secure in the knowledge that he knew exactly what he was doing, at least for the moment. It wasn't a change for him. Actually having a destination for once, he was much more used to listening to listlessly going through day after day without any other real purpose that to survive for the next. With a chuckle, he remembered the extensive conversation he and the QB had on this very subject. So, Kit, you know you want to leave this village, but do you know where? Naruto looked up at the fox, still marveling at how something with so much power in its voice could look so cute. What do you mean? QB sighed. The very word was beginning to annoy her now. She wished she could remove the word sigh from all of history. I mean, where do you wish to go after we leave the village? Naruto blushed a little when she said we, but didn't act on it. He was also blushed because he hadn't even considered this at all. Geographically was hardly his best subject. He did want to learn. He knew that knowing the layout of the land and the area around you was important to a ninja, but it didn't involve jutsu or fighting. He had trouble finding a reason to listen. He sheepishly grinned and rubbed the back of his head, an action QB knew all too well in the 7 years of her latest imprisonment. You have no idea, do you? Naruto just shrugged with that same sheepish smile, and QB had to physically stop herself from sighing again. She would learn to control this. I guess I can help you out. You still wish to be a shinobi, do you not? Naruto nodded quickly after working out that her words weren't a double negative. Well, then I would recommend one of the other hidden villages. Naruto stared at her blankly, and QB suppressed her on yet another sigh. She swore this was becoming more common, that in the rest of her life combined, she was going to have to get Naruto educated soon if she was going to keep her sanity. Yes, Naruto, there are other hidden villages. Did you really think there was only one in all the elemental nations? She had meant the question rhetorically, but Naruto hung his head in shame all the same and nodded slowly. It was almost cute to see the way he acted like a small child, even if he was in fact one. Even so, she was a ninja in training, and the academy should have gotten this out of his system straight away. She cursed his teachers. They gave her so little to work with. It might strain her even endless patience. More specifically, the 5 major villages are Leaf, as you know, as well as Rock, Mist, Cloud, and Sand. Naruto looked at her curiously, thinking about the names of each village. Village hidden in the rocks. Kyuubi nodded slowly. She really hoped Naruto wasn't considering that one. From all the enemies his father made, Irogakure was definitely not a safe place for the boy. That sounds uncomfortable. Kyuubi could help, but let out a small laugh at the boy's statement. Uncomfortable? How appropriate. I couldn't agree with you more, Kit. He smiled a little, encouraged that the QB agreed with one of his choices. It was still a strange feeling to have a friend. Mist sounds too wet. Both of them shuddered at the words. QB hated water. It got in her fur and made it stick out of funny angles, annoying to say the least. It appeared that Naruto had inherited some of her dislikes for the substance, at least when it clung to him and dragged him down. If that is your objection, I recommend you avoid Cloud as well. Naruto looked a little disappointed. He had been working towards Cloud as it had sounded the most interesting. He wondered just how you could put a village on a cloud. Of course, he was a little naive, but he wasn't an idiot. He understood that the names weren't literal. However, he still couldn't help but wonder. What do you mean? Jubi took a moment to consider just how to word this. Clouds are like water in the sky. Naruto only looked more confused. The clouds didn't look like water. He couldn't see through them. Perhaps that isn't the best way to put it. She looked around, searching for some inspiration to help her explain. Your kettle, you know how it steams? Naruto had enough experience with the kettle from his instant ramen that he could safely nod. That is because the very hot water comes out and cools quickly. Clouds are like that, but high in the sky. Naruto thought for a moment, comparing the steam from his kettle with the white puffy clouds in the sky that one of the boys in his class seemed so entranced with. He could definitely see some connection, but he didn't understand the science behind it. He decided that he was growing bored and to take the older creature's word for it, so he nodded. Good. Well, clouds are just like that. They are water in the sky, which is why rain comes from them. That was exhausting for QB to understand ninja techniques, and the like was one thing, but to not even have a simple grasp of condensation was different. She was learning to dislike Naruto's academy teachers more and more. Briefly, she considered retracting her objections to Naruto's idea of one last prank. Anyway, Kit, it appears that by elimination you have chosen our destination. She grinned a foxy smile, even as Naruto looked back confused. Huh, I didn't choose yet. Kyubi maintained her grin and warded off the tick that was beginning to appear over her eye. There are only 5 villages, Kit. You have left one and don't like 3 of the others. That only leaves Sunagakure, the village hidden in the sand. Kyubi wasn't satisfied with the choice. She would have been happy with anything Naruto had chosen, but this seemed to be for the best. She wasn't appalled by the idea of sand. There were many of her comparative species that resided in deserts, so she would be well suited. It wasn't like it affected her anyways. She would still be stuck in this dank prison cell after all. Perhaps she could get Naruto to do something about that. QB? She was broken from her internal monologue and self-congratulation as Naruto looked curiously at her. She knew that wasn't going to be good from the way his eyes had that irritating but enduring inquisitive spark. Yes, Kit. Naruto managed a smile from the way her voice softened. It had been getting incredulously loud as their last conversation had worn. What sand? She let out a deep and earth-rumbling groan before placing her paws over her eyes and pushing her head into the floor. This is going to be a long night. Naruto was happy with his previous choice, and with Kyubi's perfect knowledge of the elemental nations as his guide, he would be there in no time. He couldn't tree hop there as much as he had tried to copy the tricky technique, so he had to settle for a brisk walk. He didn't mind all that much. It was a nice night, and he had some time before the village knew he was gone and could track him effectively. What he didn't notice were the set of pale lavender eyes that followed him. Hinata enjoyed cloudy nights like these. It served to better hide her from the world. The clouds were like a blanket, protecting her from the eyes of the world. If there were no stars or moon, then there was no light to shed on her activities. When the academy year had started, her father had begun showing her a little more kindness than usual. She figured it was because he thought she would actually take her training seriously and live up to her role as the Hyuga Heiress. She did take her training seriously. Her father had no idea just how much, even with his all-seeing Byakugan. Hinata herself had activated her Kekkeigenkai at age 5, another cause for celebration back then. Those were the 2 times she had known her father to express emotion around her. All other times he would be the proper clan head. It was nights like these that she would come out into her favorite clearing, a small pasture of land that was surrounded on all sides by dense foliage that further served to hide her presence. It was because she was practicing the gentle fist defensive stances with her Byakugan active that she saw the retreating form of her secret crush. She had only known the boy for 6 months. Before that, his status as the town pariah had kept him away from the other children his age. Even before then, she had seen him around, always mistreated by the villagers for reasons she couldn't understand. When she had asked her father about it, he had plainly informed her to forget about him and focus on her training. Of course, that only strengthened her curiosity. Then the school year had started, and she had gotten to see how he behaved. He was like a role model to the young Hyuga. No matter what life threw at him, he would always pick himself up with a grin and dive right back in. They were almost polar opposites in her mind. He was loud, outgoing, and a little clumsy, whereas she was quite shy and reserved. In all the time she could have gotten to know him, she had barely spoken 5 words to the boy, barely enough that he knew her name. For some indescribable reason, she would always become flustered and embarrassed when he was close to her. For her cheeks would flush with red, and her ability to talk deteriorated from even her normal shy stuttering. Any outsider looking in on the girl's thoughts, or even somebody who just watched how she behaved, would have understood the girl had a crush on the boy, but Hinata was only 7, not versed enough in life to grasp that. Having seen the boy she admired so much seemingly walk away from the village, suppressing his chakra signature no less, she decided to follow him. Her curiosity was piqued when he showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. She wondered how he had even gotten out of the village so late. Permission was only granted to adults and shinobi. She was only allowed to leave because nobody would question the heiress to the most prestigious family in Konoha. After the Uchiha, of course. She began to worry when he started to get really far from the village, and she only now noticed the backpack slung over his shoulder and the dark clothes he was wearing. He couldn't be leaving, could he? No, this was Naruto. He never ran away from anything. However, as she tried to rack her mind to figure out what the enigmatic boy was doing, he was getting increasingly further away from her home. She wanted to call out anything to make him turn around and see her, but her body wouldn't follow her mind's commands. As if Naruto had somehow heard her thoughts, he paused a moment, as if considering some unspoken voice. He turned slowly and peered into the brush where she was currently hiding, and Hinata had to stifle a squeak as his eyes seemed to land directly on her, as if he could pierce through the darkness and see her. Hello? That was impossible. She had been hiding her movements and was practically silent. He wasn't facing her, so he couldn't have seen her. She hadn't been hiding her chakra, but there was no way Naruto could detect her because of that. She didn't have a strong chakra signature to begin with, and only a Jonin would have picked it up. Even so, Naruto was looking straight at her position. He must know somebody was there, but he didn't know who. There was no point in hiding anymore. Hinata knew Naruto was an inquisitive boy. If he thought there was somebody there, then he was going to investigate. She stepped out of the bushes into the weak light that drifted onto the path, while Naruto just looked at her curiously. Hey, you're the girl from the class, Hinata. End of chapter 2.